If you had $10,000 sitting in a bank account today, most people would ask the wrong question. They would ask where to put it. Should it go into stocks? Should it stay in cash? Should it wait for a property deposit? Should it be split across funds? Should it be invested now or later? Those questions matter, of course, but they are not the first question I would ask. The first question I would ask is this: do you understand what your first $10,000 really? Because if you do not understand that, then you can still make a decent financial move and miss the much bigger point. Your first $10,000 is not just money. It is the first moment in life when capital begins to compete with labor. That is why it matters so much. Before that point, almost everything in your financial life depends on you. Your energy, your time, your discipline, your ability to show up, your willingness to trade hours for income. That is how almost everybody begins. There is nothing wrong with that. It is the natural starting point. But once you have $10,000, something changes. Not because $10,000 is a fortune. It is not. And not because $10,000 solves your life. It usually does not. It matters because $10,000 is often the first amount large enough for a person to feel that money itself can start doing part of the work. It says that having your first $10,000 can make you feel more confident, more able to walk away from situations that no longer serve you, and more optimistic about the future. That is absolutely right. The emotional power of the first real 5 figures is often far greater than the raw arithmetic suggests. It is not just a balance. It is proof that a different relationship with money is becoming possible. Fei file site fei turn. Fei file fei, I have always thought that money should change the degree to which you are cornered. That is one of its highest uses. A person with no savings is cornered by almost everything. A late paycheck, a broken car, a bad boss, a bad landlord, a bad month in the economy, a family emergency, a hospital bill, a rent increase, a child needing help. A person with no reserves does not merely lack comfort. He lacks negotiating power. That is one of the most brutal facts in financial life. A man without savings is often forced to tolerate conditions a stronger balance sheet would have allowed him to reject. That is why your first $10,000 is not simply a milestone. It is leverage, it is optionality, it is breathing room, it is the first quiet voice in your financial life saying that maybe, from this point forward, not every decision has to be made with your back against the wall. Now I know what many people think when they hear that. They think $10,000 is not enough to matter. I have never found that view especially into $10,000 may not be enough to retire on. It may not be enough to transform your visible lifestyle. It may not be enough to impress anyone. Good. I do not care whether it impresses anyone. I care what it changes. And $10,000 can change a great deal if handled properly. The source text makes one very practical point that I agree with strongly. It says that before you do anything heroic with your first $10,000, you need to make sure the foundations of your financial life are not weak. Emergency savings, short-term needs, and expensive debt matter first. That is exactly the right place to start. People love to jump straight to investing because investing sounds exciting and adult. But if your roof is leaking, you do not begin by discussing chandeliers. Fei file site fei turn. Fei file fei, I have always preferred strong foundations to flashy activity. The market will always be there tomorrow. Your emotional stability may not be if you are investing money that should have been protecting you from short-term reality. This is where many new investors go wrong. They hear that money in a savings account is lazy. They hear that investing returns are higher over long periods. They hear that inflation erodes cash. All of those things can be true. Then, without doing the dull work first, they throw themselves into the market with money. They cannot emotionally afford to leave there. That is not investing. That is self-sabotage disguised as ambition. The source material is careful on this point, and I admire that. It says that a person should usually build a 3-month emergency fund if only supporting himself, perhaps 6 months if others depend on him, and even more if caution is warranted. It also points out that short-term goals such as a home deposit do not belong in the same risk bucket as long-term investing money. That is sober advice, and I think sobriety is underrated in finance. Fei file site fei turn. Fei file strong financial structure begins by answering 3 separate questions. What money must remain available soon? What money must remain stable no matter what? And what money can be left alone long enough to compound? Those are different pools. Most trouble begins when people treat them as one pool because they are impatient to feel like investors. I would rather be boring and solvent than exciting and cornered. That may not be fashionable advice, but it is durable advice. Let us assume, then, that the basics are in place. There is some emergency margin. Short-term obligations are not being confused with long-term capital. Expensive debt is either manageable or eliminated. Now we can speak properly about the first 10,000. Why should it be invested? The source material gives 3 reasons, and I think all 3 are fundamentally sound. First, savings rates are usually too low to create meaningful compounding over long periods when compared with a well-diversified investment portfolio. Second, inflation eats quietly at cash. Third, compounding turns small beginnings into surprisingly large outcomes when time is allowed to do the heavy lifting. Those are not merely textbook points. They are the central mechanics of how ordinary people become financially strong without needing extraordinary luck. Fay-file site, Fay-turn, Fay-file, Fay. I have spent a lifetime watching compounding work, and I still think people underestimate it because they keep looking at the early years. Compounding is deeply unimpressive at first. That is why almost nobody respects it enough. A person invests $10,000 and earns 8%. The first year, it becomes $10,800. Nobody faints. Nobody calls the newspaper. Nobody feels transformed. The second year, the increase is a little larger. Then a little larger, then a little larger. For a long time, the process looks polite. Then later it begins to look unfair. That is what compounding does. It is small until it is not. The source text understands this quite well. It walks through the arithmetic of how 10,000 can become more than 21,000 after a decade at roughly 8%, and far more over 20 years, even without adding another cent. That matters, not because the exact assumptions will always hold, but because it teaches the right lesson. Time does more work than excitement. Fay-file site, Fay-turn, Fay-file, Fay. I have often said that the stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. I still believe that, but I would add something else. Compounding is a device for transferring the future to the person who can stay still long enough to collect it. That is the true secret. Not brilliance, not prediction, not heroic timing, duration. This is one reason your first 10,000 matters so much. It is often the first time in life you can feel the slope of the hill. You can begin to understand, not just in theory but emotionally, that money left invested can grow faster than money left idle. And if that lesson lands early enough, it can change the whole trajectory of a life. The source material puts this in a way I like. It says that the longer you leave the money, the wider the gap becomes between the lazy path and the compounding path. That is exactly right. The difference between doing nothing and doing something sensible with your first 10,000 is not only what happens this year, it is the widening effect over the decades that follow. Fay-file site, Fay-turn, Fay-file, Fay. This is why procrastination is so costly. A great many people tell themselves that they are being careful when they delay investing. Sometimes they are, often they are simply uncomfortable. The source text speaks directly to this mistake. It says that people delay because they want to learn a little more, feel a little more ready, or receive some final permission before beginning. Meanwhile, time continues moving, and the compounding years that could have been theirs are given away in silence. That is a real cost. It may be invisible on any given day. Over decades, it becomes enormous. Fay-file site, Fay-turn, Fay-file, Fay. I understand the fear. I have no contempt for it. When you first begin, the market feels like a giant machine built by other people with more knowledge than you. You worry that if you move too soon, you will make a foolish mistake. So you read one more book, you listen to one more podcast, you promise yourself that next month, after just a little more research, you will finally begin. Then suddenly 10 years are gone. This is one of the most expensive forms because investing does not require early perfection. It requires early participation. That distinction matters. A person who waits for perfect confidence usually waits too long. A person who starts sensibly small and with broad diversification can often learn while still allowing time to remain on his side. The source material uses a very practical example to show this. It compares investing 10,000 at age 25 versus waiting until 35 and shows how dramatically the end result diverges by age 60, even if no other money is ever added. That is not a magic trick. That is the cost of surrendering a decade to hesitation. File site turn, file. This is also why I care much less about the perfect entry point than most people do. Time in the market matters more than timing the market. That phrase has been repeated so often that many people no longer hear it. They should hear it because it is true. Now, let me clarify something important. Time in the market is not an argument for recklessness. It is not permission to buy anything. It is not a license to chase whatever is exciting. It is not proof that hot stories will save you. In fact, one of the strongest parts of your source file is the warning against exactly that mistake. It says that when people first begin learning about investing, they are especially vulnerable to hype, trends, and the intoxicating belief that they can already identify the next big winner. It even invokes the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a perfectly reasonable way to describe the problem. Early knowledge often produces more confidence than competence. File turn. File I have seen that many times. A person learns just enough to feel clever, but not enough to respect what he does not know. That is a dangerous stage. He starts buying companies he does not understand. He starts repeating stories other people have already pushed into the price. He starts confusing excitement with insight. He starts investing as if investing should feel thrilling. I do not think investing should feel thrilling. I think it should feel boring. That may sound disappointing. Good. Many fortunes have been saved by being a little disappointed by how boring intelligent investing actually is. The source material argues that beginners should keep things simple with broad, globally diversified funds, such as an SAP fund or an all-world index fund. I think that is sensible advice for most people, beginning with their first real sum of money. Diversification is not glamorous, but glamour is not the objective. Survival is, simplicity is, participation is. Low fees are. The source text also correctly emphasizes that the fees on your chosen funds matter tremendously over long periods. That is another deeply unglamorous truth that has enormous practical importance. Turn, file. A good financial life is often built from unglamorous truths repeated with enough discipline. Save first, diversify, control fees, automate, stay invested, do not panic, do not chase. Those things do not make exciting conversation. They make durable results. And durability is what I admire. The same source file also makes a point about retirement or pension matching that deserves emphasis. If an employer matches contributions, that is extraordinary. It is difficult to beat a guaranteed immediate return provided by someone else. Too many people ignore this because it feels ordinary or bureaucratic. Ordinary and bureaucratic can still be valuable. In many cases, they are the first place your money should go before you look for more exotic answers elsewhere. File turn. File. This is a broader principle I have believed for a very long time. Do not step over dollars to pick up nickels. Take the obvious advantage first. Maximize the simple structures that are clearly in your favor. Then worry about refinements. Many people reverse that order because refinements feel intelligent, foundations feel dull. That is childish thinking. Now, let me return to something the source text says that I think is central: inflation. A savings account can feel respectable because the balance rises. The problem is that what matters is not the nominal number. What matters is the purchasing power behind it. If inflation is eating away at what your money can buy, then a positive rate on paper may still leave you poorer in practical terms than you imagine. The source material gives examples showing how the same 10,000 buys substantially less over time because prices rise. That is exactly why mere cash accumulation beyond the reserves you genuinely need is often not enough. Idle money may look prudent while slowly being diminished. File turn. File. This is one reason investing matters at all. Not because cash is stupid. Cash is useful. Cash is safety. Cash is optionality. Cash is what keeps you from becoming a forced seller in the wrong moment. But cash is not a complete plan. It is one layer of the structure. The problem comes when people turn a layer into the whole house. A person who never moves beyond saving may feel responsible and still end up with money that is not working as hard as his labor worked to create it. The source text phrases this nicely when it says savings were not working half as hard as the person who earned them. That is an excellent line because it gets to the emotional heart of the matter. If you are working hard and your money is not, then the structure is incomplete. Fay file site fay turn. Fay file fay. That is why your first 10,000 is such a critical turning point. It is not only the first amount that can materially change your sense of security, it is often the first amount that can begin teaching you the relationship between safety and growth. You need safety, you need short-term liquidity, you need reserves, but you also need part of your capital to begin doing what capital does best, which is compound over time when placed in productive assets. Learning that balance early is worth an enormous amount. Now let me speak about one more beginner mistake. The source text identifies because it may be the costliest of all once someone has finally started. Selling at the wrong time. The document calls it materializing your losses. That is a slightly awkward phrase. But the point is excellent. When markets fall, the emotional urge is to pull out, to seek relief, to stop the pain of seeing numbers decline. But if you sell in panic, you often convert temporary volatility into permanent loss. The better investors, the source says, stay calm or even invest more when markets fall. That is exactly right, though emotionally much harder than it sounds. Fay file a site fay turn. Fay file fay. This is why the order of operations matters so much. If you entered the market with money that should have been your emergency fund, then a downturn is not just a downturn. It is a threat to your immediate life, and your emotional brain takes over. If you entered with proper foundations in place, then volatility becomes something you can withstand. That is not a small difference. It is the whole difference. The source text recognizes this and circles back to the opening point. Build the emergency fund, set aside short-term cash, pay off expensive debt. Use workplace matches, use tax-efficient accounts where available. Then automate investing and stop staring at the screen. That is sensible. It is not flashy. It is the kind of system that works. Fay file site fay turn. Fay file fay. I have often thought that a large part of intelligent investing is the design of a structure that protects you from yourself. The structure should make good behavior easy and bad behavior difficult. It should reduce the temptation to meddle. It should keep reserves where reserves belong and long-term capital where long-term capital belongs. It should allow the market to fluctuate without forcing your hand. And if you can do that early, beginning with something as modest as the first 10,000, you may be astonished by what that early structure becomes later in life. This is why I do not dismiss the emotional importance of the first 5 figures. It is the first pile of money many people ever own that can be used not merely to survive, but to begin constructing a system. That system matters more than the exact first-year return. It matters more than the perfect stock. It matters more than whether you entered on Tuesday or next month. What matters is that you understood the moment. You stopped treating 10,000 as a static number. You began treating it as working capital in the broadest sense. Capital for protection, capital for flexibility, capital for compounding, capital for a future in which your life is not supported by labor alone. If you get that right, then the first 10,000 is not small at all. It is the first brick in a structure that may one day look very large. And if you get it wrong, you do not only lose some return, you may lose time. And in finance, time is often the one thing you cannot cheaply buy back. So if you ask me what I would do with the first 10,000 sitting in a bank account today, my answer is not one dramatic move. I would build the structure. I would protect the emergency layer. I would isolate short-term goals. I would eliminate expensive debt if it were there. I would capture any workplace match. I would use tax-advantaged space where it exists. Then I would put long-term capital into broad, low-cost productive assets and let time do the heavy lifting. And perhaps most importantly, I would refuse to make the beginner's mistake of treating investing like entertainment. It is not entertainment, it is architecture. The earlier you understand that, the more that first 10,000 can do for you, not because 10,000 is magic, because time is